I'm going to talk to you about the role of specialist nurse in context of recognition health. I'm just going to bring it to the people really and personalise my talk and use a case study approach. Now I've changed the names and some of the circumstances of people, but I just want to illustrate the feeling and emotion that's involved when you're looking after somebody with dementia, either as a family member or you're living with dementia throughout your journey. So I'm going to use the following 7 points to illustrate it. So starting with realising something's not right and seeking help, being assessed, hearing the diagnosis, understanding the diagnosis, planning the future, living as full and active life as possible, and supporting family, friends and the wider community. Now each of these points are broad and it can incorporate a wide range of clinical and psychosocial interventions, information and advice. And I'm going to speak to each point, outlining as a case study. Now, Sandra first noticed changes to her functioning about 5 or 6 years ago. She was no longer taking part in activities like managing day-to-day finances, planning travel, and was finding motivation to keep in touch with friends difficult and forgetting details of information that was shared by her husband and children. This started to impact on the family as Sandra was forgetting to collect the children from school at the end of term, not phoning them regularly, forgetting details of her husband's business and his returns home. And sometimes she was out doing other activities or hadn't prepared the home for their homecoming. For example, there was no shopping or meal preparation. Sandra's husband spoke to her many times over about a 2-year period, fearing that their relationship was breaking down, and the children started to exhibit change in behaviour at school and not doing so well in their classwork. Sandra insisted things were fine. There was nothing wrong. And over those first few years, Sandra became increasingly isolated from friends as she was forgetting lunch appointments, visits to the gym declined, and she didn't return calls from her friends. Eventually, her husband was so concerned that he persuaded her to visit her GP. He attended with her. No physical cause was found for Sandra's symptoms. Her MRI scan was clear. But she was approaching menopause and her lifestyle was busy and sometimes lonely with her children at school and her husband away a lot on business. After discussion, Sandra agreed that she would be treated for depression and go and see a counsellor with her husband for some relational support, and also see the counsellor alone to address some of the issues that had been raised during that GP consultation. Now, Sandra's GP monitored her regularly with her counsellor, but her symptoms didn't improve. In fact, her husband reported that things at home and relationally had got worse. Sandra was persuaded by her husband to seek further neurological assessment, a big step. Sandra still felt there was nothing wrong. Now, the role of the specialist nurse here was that we were able to talk to Sandra and her husband about her symptoms, the history of her problems, and what to expect during the neurological assessment. This was a scary time for both of them. With Sandra's permission, the nurse liaised with Sandra's GP and her counsellor to get a fuller picture. And by this time, Sandra's husband was really worried, realising that something was seriously wrong. He felt guilty that he'd not sought more help earlier and had thought that their marriage was ending. So a pretty mess, really. The specialist nurse spent some time with him on his own, listening to his side of the story, which helped to get a fuller picture of what the family had been going through. A really important point there. I'm going to turn to Matthew. Matthew retired at 68 years old and had always enjoyed his work and immediately missed the routine and comradeship of his workplace. Matthew had suffered depression in his 40s. He'd been involved in a serious accident and the sudden death of a sibling followed shortly after that. He had a good idea and understanding of how he'd felt in that period, and when he presented at clinic for assessment, he realised that his symptoms were not, in his word, just depression. His wife was dubious, feeling that he'd become lazy following retirement. And you can see how difficult it becomes with the balance between you in a family. He'd stopped playing golf and going to the gym, and just generally had become isolated, so similar to Sandra. At assessment, the results of Matthew's assessment showed no physical causes for his symptoms. He was presenting with signs of depression, which he recognised. But his MRI scan, which Emma was talking about earlier as part of the assessment, showed early changes indicating MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. He talked to the neurologist with his wife, and further assessment was advised from neuropsychology and a repeat MRI in about 4 months' time. Now that left Matthew and his wife in a sort of flux of not really feeling that they knew what was wrong. So the specialist nurse contacted Matthew and arranged to meet him and his wife at their home to discuss the assessment process. So that was to talk about the MRI, he'd had a lumbar puncture, he'd been through a neuropsychological assessment by that time, and at his request, after the discussion with the nurse, some reading material was given to him, and we've kept in touch to answer his questions and to help him with some of the issues out of that information. The nurses met with him again since that to talk about keeping as active as possible. He's joined our Active Minds programme, and the importance of keeping physically healthy. His difficulties with motivation, which is some part probably relevant to his depression and maybe some to the MCI as well. We talked about that, and a plan's been made so that he can regularly start at the gym again. And he's talked to a friend about the issues he's having, and the friend now meets him once a week on the golf course. So he's started to get back into his social circle again. And the specialist nurse is kept just in the background now to advise Matthew before he comes back to have a review with the neurologist, and then we'll pick up with him following that assessment. Now, hearing the diagnosis. Now, there's people in this room that have been through this and will probably, maybe, feel the same as Julie did. Julie was feeling very angry and upset when she attended for assessment. She attended with her brother. She was tearful at each of her appointments and unable to talk to the neurologist about her feelings. She attended with her brother after he'd spoken to her about his concerns for her welfare, and he'd noticed over about a 2-year period she'd become increasingly isolated and low in mood. She'd lost a considerable amount of weight, and he suspected she was spending most days in bed and drinking alcohol to excess. Now, following Julie's assessment and diagnosis of early Alzheimer's disease, Julie received the diagnosis with her brother, with the neurologist carefully and sensitively explaining what he'd found in the assessment and what the diagnosis was. She was prescribed Arasat at a low dose to start, and then that was increased to the 10 milligram therapeutic dose. But it left a gap for Julie. She was still feeling angry and didn't really understand why everybody was so worried about her. So she agreed with the neurologist to come and see the specialist nurse and to talk with her and her brother about some of the concerns that they both had. Things like Julie's medication compliance, so taking her medication on time and regularly. Her emotional well-being at that time was very fragile. Her alcohol consumption was quite worrying, and her weight loss and her continuing isolation from friends and work colleagues. Now, nurse first met Julie in clinic, and she was feeling very angry that day. She didn't really want to be there, and she really felt that her brother was making her look stupid. She didn't want to take the medication, there was nothing wrong with her, and she just wanted to continue with her life. Now, at that meeting, the nurse was able to engage with Julie, not about Alzheimer's disease and memory loss and her weight loss, but about her life, about her travels, and about her work, which she had loved before she retired. This built a little tiny bit of a relationship, and Julie agreed to a home visit the following week. A relationship was gradually built up, and the nurse visited over a 6-month period repeating and reinforcing with Julie that she was managing well, she could remain active and live alone using practical memory enhancing strategies and some professional companionship. Julie didn't want to hear a diagnosis for months. She required careful support and discussion to build up a relationship before she was able to hear about what was happening to her. Now, understanding the diagnosis is different for everybody. I'm going to turn to a couple. I was asked to meet Mr. and Mrs. Penn due to problems with Mr. Penn's behaviour. It had changed very radically due to an infection, and Mrs. Penn was really struggling to manage at home, especially at night. When I met her, they hadn't slept for over 3 weeks. They'd had broken nights, and Mrs. Penn had been awake most of those nights. He'd received his diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease 3 years previously, and although his wife had attended all his consultations with him, which had involved a variety of professionals in the UK and abroad, prior to his diagnosis, Mr. Penn had received major surgery for a severe bleed on the brain. Now, following that surgery, his wife had spoken to the surgeon and been told that there'd be no further deterioration of Mr. Penn's cognitive functioning. Now, she'd misunderstood the impact of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease following the surgery, because obviously it was two different things, but hearing that the surgery had been successful had given her the hope. She'd not understood that Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative illness and thought Mr. Penn was playing sick. A home visit was arranged, and I went out to meet them and spent time with them together, and then later alone with Mrs. Penn. I was able to explain about Alzheimer's disease and why Mr. Penn was struggling with his personal care, spatial awareness, memory loss, and word finding. I also explained about the impact an infection can have and suggested a medication review with Mr. Penn's GP. They hadn't been involved with any member of a clinical team for some while. Planning for the future. I'm going to return to Sandra, who I spoke to earlier. I've continued to work with Sandra over about a 10-month period. To begin with, I facilitated a family meeting. I've already explained about the distress the family were in. We discussed the impact of Alzheimer's disease and how that was impacting on everybody's life. And I met individually with Sandra's children, her mother-in-law, on several sessions with her husband. She maintains in constant email contact with the children and her husband, and I liaise regularly with the rest of the clinical team to update on the sessions I have with Sandra and reevaluate the care plan. I've worked with Sandra to help her talk about her feelings about her memory loss and the future. And over 10 months, you can see that's taken quite a long time. Together, we've built a book of memories about the family home, which is very, very important to her. And we're now building memory books and boxes for each of her children. She's very centred with her family, and she feels it's very important to leave something for her children for the future. Now, she's really enjoyed being creative, and I have a colleague in the audience who is a great ambassador of cognitive stimulation, works in groups. And the work I've been doing with Sandra is similar, but it's been on a one-to-one basis. Now, Sandra's been able to talk about her plans for her future through her memory books, and she's also been able to talk about what she would like for her long-term care. And over the next few months, Sandra's going to start work with a companion to help with day-to-day household chores and to develop the creative skills which she loves to engage in. Right, living a life active as possible. I'm just going to return to Julie very quickly. Julie has come on in leaps and bounds with her confidence. We've talked about alcohol consumption and even made a little personalised fridge magnet which reminds her each evening just to have one glass of wine and then put the top on. Her professional home carer has made a fantastic relationship with her and has imparted the confidence for Julie to join an over 65 group in her local community. And the specialist nurse role has been to continue to keep in touch with Julie by phone, sometimes by home visit, and with her brother just to monitor her progress. Supporting family, friends and the wider community. Some of this has already been touched on. Mr. and Mrs. Penn was struggling, but with the start of home care, she now feels confident enough to go away for a couple of nights every fortnight. And she's really very well linked now into the clinical team at Recognition, which has been very important for her. For friends, there's a few examples here. Sandra's now in contact with a friend and goes to the gym. It's raised her confidence a little bit. She wouldn't have gone on her own. Mrs. Penn has talked to a very close friend about her husband's Alzheimer's disease, and she's now helping Mrs. Penn look to the future and look at residential care homes as a backup plan to the home care. For the wider community, this has already been talked about, but I was just going to mention the Prime Minister's Challenge, which Andrew's talked about, and also the Dementia Action Alliance, which health and social care and charity organisations have signed up to. So things are moving along very quickly. And then just to summarise, some key points here. People with a diagnosis of dementia want to live their lives as normally as possible. A timely diagnosis provides more opportunity to optimise and extend good quality of life. And we need to think about Alzheimer's as a chronic condition that should be managed proactively, like diabetes. Like we've just said, it needs to be lived with and life needs to be lived to the full. Now, research supports specialist nursing. There's a lot of evidence now to support. A lot of qualitative research has been done, and these are just a few of the references that I work to. And our role is continuing, changing and developing along this research and developments in our field. And being a specialist dementia nurse is one of the most rewarding roles that I've had.